Very good evening to all, and welcome to this discussion on future of impact investing and Indian ecosystem. So, for taking the discussions forward, we have an expert with us, Mr. Anurag Agrawal. So, all of you who have followed the impact investing in India, he is a known face to all of you. Anurag is the Group Chief Operating Officer of Avishkar Group. So Avishkar Group is across the entire spectrum of impact investing, if you'll see. They have a microfinance institution, they have an SME focused NBFC, they are into consultancy. So a real breadth of work they are into. And Anurag has an experience of 17 years, out of which I think almost 15 years is directly or indirectly with this segment. So real an expert on this matter. Now, if we see Anurag's background, he is an MBA and he started his career from as a banker with ICICI Bank. So my first question, Anurag, would be, well, why impact investing? What interested you that you have shifted from conventional banking to impact investing?
Thanks, Amit. Thanks for that introduction. I am from the same business school as you. You are my senior, so thank you for that introduction. So yeah, I graduated from Convention B School. I did my MBA from Manipal TFI Management Institute with a specialization in finance, and I got placed in ICICI Bank in corporate banking. So I started my career from Mumbai in the corporate banking division of ICICI Bank. And prior to joining ICICI Bank, I really had no sort of no engagement with the development sector as such. So I started there. I come from a small business family from Varanasi. So everybody other than me and from my extended family was in business. I was the black sheep in the family who went out and studied, and eventually was doing some work for somebody else. So I did this corporate banking stint with ICICI Bank for a couple of years. And in those 2 years, what was very clear to me was that this is not what I want to do for the rest of my life. The problem was I was not clear on what I want to do with the rest of my life. So that was a big dilemma. And I was just sort of going through the motions, and I was new to Bombay. It was my first time in Bombay. Life was very mechanical. You get up early, take the local train. I was living in Kandivali. Office was in Lower Parel, so it was quite monotonous, and I wasn't quite enjoying it. I got sort of a lucky break. So the division that I used to work in was wholesale banking group. It was headed by a gentleman called Nachiket Moore, who also happened to be heading the rural banking division. And there was a small group within ICICI Bank called the Social Initiatives Group, which was doing a lot of white papers, writing a lot of white papers. And there was another colleague of mine who had joined as a management trainee with me. He was part of another group called the Alternate Channels Group, which was trying to experiment with different technologies to reach out to unbanked customers, mostly focused on a pilot project in Dharavi. And that was really my first exposure to this space. I heard about it from him. And there were a small team of about 6 people. They had done a bunch of experiments, and after completing a year of those experiments, they were looking to expand the team. And he reached out to me saying that, this is what we are doing, and would you be interested in that kind of a work? So the moment I heard about it, I had absolutely no exposure to it. So I started reading more and more about it. The Social Initiatives Group used to write a lot of white papers around this whole subject of financial inclusion and what needs to be done there. So the more I read, the more interested I got. I thought this was a great opportunity. India was a sunrise sector. I was just 2 years into my career, so very new. Since it was a sunrise sector, anybody who's into that space is going to be new. So it's not like people will come with a huge amount of experience. Also, India happened to be the largest market. So from just in terms of number of people who would need to be who are financially excluded and therefore would become target customers and target beneficiaries for a financial inclusion work. India happened to be the largest market. Particularly the part of India that I came from, which was Eastern UP, was also amongst the poorest regions in India. and also in terms of actual penetration, the lowest penetration. So the thought that came to me was that this seems like an excellent area where I can use my learning in the area of finance, and there is a big business opportunity. I had very little experience, so my thought was that let me gain some exposure and learning in that space, and then maybe I can look at starting something on my own. So it was a combination of the business opportunity that I saw. It was a combination of somewhere that entrepreneurial DNA that I want to do something on my own, and thirdly, I thought if I can combine something in my work where it is more than just making money for yourself, then that's a great combination. So those three aspects. Now the question was, how do I start getting my hands dirty with this space? So my first attempt was within the bank itself. So ICICI Bank used to be the largest player in this financial inclusion space in India. It used to have roughly about 70% of the market share in terms of as a lender to microfinance companies in India. So I first tried to move within the bank, but as it happens in larger organizations, there are internal pulls and pressures. So while the person who was heading this particular division was ready to take me, my own department was a very small team of 4 people, and I had an understanding with my boss that at the end of financial year I will move into this new division. But at the end of the year, my boss got promoted and he moved to another division, and I started reporting to my super boss, who felt now I can't let go two of my members of my 4-member team, so he stopped my movement. But I was very determined. I was quite clear that this is an area which is very interesting, and I want to do something in this. So I started reaching out to people. I didn't really know many people at that point in the development space. So I, through contacts, I started reaching out to people. There were 3 people that I wrote actually exactly the same email to. One was the founder of a company called SKS Microfinance, which later on became India's first listed company, Vikram Akula. Second was a small NGO in Bangalore, which today is a very large small finance bank called Jan Lakshmi Bank. So I reached out to the founder of that, Ramesh Ramanathan. And third was the founder of my current company, Vineet Rai, who was running a small impact fund called Avishkar, and along with that, an advisory company called IntelliCap. Now, SKS was based out of Hyderabad, Jan Lakshmi was based out of Bangalore, and this company was based in Mumbai. And since I was in Mumbai, it was sheer providence that I first met Vineet, who had simultaneously set up Avishkar, which is an impact investment platform, and along with that had set up IntelliCap, which was an advisory company. Now, Vineet, as a founder of these 2 companies, started with only 1 lakh rupee of capital. So that was the total capital base. And he was already into his 4th year of Avishkar, the fund, and he had managed to gather all of 5 crores together from a bunch of NRIs in Singapore. So that was the size of the fund. 5 crores was the size of the fund. IntelliCap was an advisory company with 1 lakh capital, and there were 4 other people, all of them under the age of 30. And I went and met him. One of the things that the company was looking to do was to set up a pilot project to start urban microfinance in Mumbai. So I thought to myself that instead of joining, 2 established larger players, if I can join a startup company which is doing everything from scratch, then that's the best experience for me. If I have to start something on my own later on, so I took the plunge. I had a big fight with my parents when that was happening, because obviously this was a very small company. It couldn't afford to pay the kind of salary that I was getting in ICICI Bank. It was also a completely unknown field. Nobody in my family had heard of anything called financial inclusion or microfinance, or even joining a startup wasn't so fashionable back then. And I was just 2 years into my career, so they thought I was going to be taking a big risk. But in my mind, the biggest risk I could have taken at that point of time was to not try out what I wanted to do, because at that point of time I really had no obligations, financial commitments. So I thought to myself that if I have to take a risk, this is the perfect time to take that risk. And even if it doesn't work out, I can always go back and do what I was doing earlier. So my idea was to get exposure in this space. I told the founder very clearly that I'm coming here only for 2 years, and after 2 years, my idea is to go back and set up something on my own. So it's been 15 years already. I'm still part of this team. That team of 5 people is now grown to a team of about 7,000 people that we have in the group. From $1 million that we were managing at that point of time, we have now managing a little over $1 billion. So it's been an interesting journey over the last 15 years. I would say, uh, uh, the kind of people, most importantly, that were working there, because nobody in the team was really working to maximize their monetary inflow. Everybody was very aligned. They were doing it because that's what they wanted to do. That's what brought us all together, and I think that is what has held us in good steam. So this is somewhere between, you can say, a job and the entrepreneurial fire that was there. We've managed to create a lot of new businesses. Somewhere, some things have worked out, some things have failed. So for the number of things that we do today, we have tried twice as many things which have not gone anywhere. So it's been a very, very interesting journey, and it continues to be a very interesting journey because the space is very, very large, and what we have done so far is only a drop in the ocean. So there's really lots to do.
So, Anurag, it's very, very interesting, I'll say, your journey from Varanasi, Uttar Pradesh, then again being in Bombay, then how you went about shortlisting the three entities where you could have gone, and as the fate would have decided, you ended up here. And really, the journey from maybe that entity of 1 lakh rupee capital to maybe now you are all managing about $1 billion now. So it's a real big journey. I mean, a team of 5 again going and becoming a team of 7,000. So that really reflects on your entrepreneurial zeal and the way you really put across. You always had that fire probably within you. So a lot many people, especially students who are there, attendees who are watching this and listening to you, surely will get a very good understanding of how you really need to have fire in the belly to actually move forward in life. You also referred in your discussion, Anurag, that it's all about business, right? You come from a business family. Now, conventional wisdom in India says that if you have to do social good, probably it is left for either government or for not-for-profit organizations, right? So, one is that part A, I'll have my questions as two parts. Part A would be that how do you think? I mean, has it changed now? First of all, perception part of it, that something, an entity which is for profit can actually do good, maybe to n number of people, maybe even better than maybe a government enterprise or an NGO. So that's first part of my question. Second part is that still, if we look at this entire spectrum of creating a social impact, then all these three key players, whether it's NGO or it's a government entity, government enterprise, and these entities which are for profit, they actually have to come together and synergize. So two parts to this question. First part is how much the thought has changed that actually for profit organizations can actually do a lot of good for the society. And second, how is the synergy playing out between these three entities, government, NGO, and for profit organizations in changing the social landscape?
Yeah, so Amit, at least my personal thought process was not really coming from a NGO or a charity point of view. So the way I, explained earlier, I was looking at it as a huge scope of doing something substantial. I looked at it as a, business opportunity, as a career opportunity for doing something which was meaningful rather than, just making the maximum amount of money. There was a personal angle where, I thought it'll be, good to be closer to my family. Actually left home at the age of 11 to join boarding school, and then it was college, and then MBA, and then work. So I've been out for a very long time. So I thought, it's something that I can do close to home. It is something that as an entrepreneur I can call my own, rather than being a small fish in a very big pond where you really, whether you exist or you don't exist doesn't really matter. So it was about more meaning to my work, uh, but certainly that element was there, that it has to be meaningful also from a larger point of view rather than just making money. So I was very clear about that. Now, what I was very fortunate to have is to come together with a bunch of people who were also like-minded. So Avishkar actually started in 2000 and 2001, actually March 2001, and Intellicap, which was our advisory company. These were the two entities that existed in the group when I came together. Was also starting in March 2002. Within a year of each other with hardly any capital, but the founders' thought process was also very similar and very aligned. That a lot of developmental work at that point of time used to happen through not-for-profit. In fact, the word impact investing itself was not coined at that point of time. And he came up with this whole idea. He himself actually studied forestry, actually lived in a jungle for 4 years, came out of that, went as a research associate in IIM Ahmedabad, and then from there he became the CEO of probably what was India's first incubator called Gyan, which was a IIM Ahmedabad and Government of Gujarat collaboration. And through that experience, what he learned was that he was working with a lot of farmers and trying to commercialize their innovations on the ground. What he learned was that there was basically no dearth of ideas that are going around. But what you need is a risk capital, which he set up Avishkar. He also didn't come from a venture capital background, so he was also discovering it as he went along. So his idea was, can I take risk capital to rural India and create local jobs and come up with innovative ideas? That's how the name Avishkar came about. The closest he could get to innovation in Hindi. And along with that, not just capital, also you need intellectual capital. So Intellicap, actually the full name of the company is Intellectual Capital. It was an advisory company which was supposed to bring human talent, and essentially what he was trying to do was to bring human capital and financial capital together to solve developmental issues. This was a completely new thought process. In fact, there were only two funds globally which were trying to do this for-profit investing into companies which we called social enterprises or impact enterprises to create developmental outcomes on the ground. There was us as Avishkar, and there was a US-based fund called Acumen. Now, Acumen itself was set up as a not-for-profit, so it was basically channeling charity money and deploying it into for-profit companies on the ground, but it had no obligation to return it. But unlike Acumen, Avishkar itself was, firstly, we didn't come from very moneyed backgrounds, right? So we didn't have any capital of our own. I told you it took us, 5 years to raise the first $1 million or first 5 crores. And we started investing as little as 10 lakhs, 20 lakhs into these companies.
Right.
So our thought process right from the beginning was very clear that we will look for profit solutions that are solving core issues. And our hypothesis was that through the for-profit this business model of investment, we are able to create scale. So whatever we are trying to solve for, because we are operating in such a large country with such large numbers of low-income population, we wanted to do this at scale. And our thought process was that this is only possible if you have created a scalable, sustainable solution. And it was equally important to demonstrate that the investments that we were making were able to generate a return on that investment, and we were able to exit.
Right. So Anurag, one query here. Yeah. So in fact, our attendees here actually want to know that how do you actually filter? So when you have to make an investment, and if an entrepreneur comes to you, since you are into an impact segment, so how do you actually evaluate a proposal? A conventional investment one can understand. It's all about financial parameters, the idea. You look at the profile of the guy and how he'll take it about, right? That's what you look at as seed stage or the initial stages. But when we talk about something in impact segment, how do you typically analyze? So at least even for the people who are here who might be eager to approach you, entities like you, what should they have in place, and how are you go about evaluating future prospects for investment purposes?
Yeah, so for any investments that we would make from our fund in Avishkar, we are currently on our 6th fund. We on the capital side, we manage close to about $400 million. We've invested in about 65 odd companies. We've also exited 32 companies. So what we've been able to demonstrate is that you can do this. You can create an exit, and we've generated roughly about 2.9 times of the capital that was invested in these companies as exit proceeds, roughly about 25% IRR on those investments, which is actually comparable to what you would expect to make in the mainstream tech VC world as well, right? Each fund that we've had has had a very, very specific mandate or thesis for investment. So the first fund that we were investing in, we were ourselves learning, right? We were making very, very tiny investments, and we were basically looking for good people trying to do good. Our experience has been that good people trying to do good is extremely poor investments. So, so because for any investment of this nature, venture capital, it's extremely important that you are able to scale the venture and you are able to get it to a point where you can exit. And if you are not able to do that, then many people think venture capital is a business of investments. It's actually a business of exits, because it's
one filter
hardly
anyway,
anything.
Anurag, you have given us. So one
Correct.
filter anyway you have given us. You will not invest in good people who are just there doing good, right? So one filter we have understood. Something more about it, because
Correct.
people will be really interested.
Correct.
That actually how Anurag really evaluates. He's there for 15 years. They have done some marvelous exits, and the kind of returns they have generated. Even I mean, conventional even companies who have invested in tech enterprises probably also have not generated. So what are those filters? So one, actually, you really spoke about that. It shouldn't be a conventional just do good, but not really having back of the mind any plan or execution and scalable model. Scale is what you told about. Yes.
Scale and strong unit economics. So that is something that any traditional VC will also look at. As a impact focused fund, of course, for us the criteria on impact is equally important. I would say it is the first and foremost criteria. So we will not even look at a venture from a return perspective if that impact criteria is not met. So like I said, each fund has a very specific thesis. So when we go and raise the fund, we write something called a PPM, a sort of a prospectus, which we take to the investors. And in that fund, in that prospectus, we outline what are the sectors, what are the segments that we are looking to invest in. So there is, so we do our own research and analysis, and we figure out where do we see opportunity. So for example, out of the 6 funds, we had 2 funds which were very focused on this financial inclusion space, right? And these were actually the first 2 funds to come up that made investments in microfinance in India, for instance, right? So we actually seeded a lot of companies from scratch. Not only did we invest, so for example, some of these companies have gone on to become listed companies, like for example, Equitas, or have gone on to become banks from zero. Utkarsh, which is a bank from my hometown in Banaras, was seeded from scratch. In fact, the founder of the company is actually an ex-colleague from ICICI Bank. We convinced the person to actually quit the job, start the company. Our advisory company was parallelly running a program to incubate MFIs. So it incubated about 25 companies. Some of those companies we invested from the fund. So Utkarsh and Suryodaya are examples of companies which we incubated through our incubation program, invested from our fund, and these have gone on to become, Utkarsh today is a 7,000 crore AUM company on its own. It has 5,000 crores of deposits collected from low-income borrowers. So essentially what we do is we have a thesis. For example, in the last fund, we had a thesis around waste management. The one before that, we had identified opportunity in, sanitation, for instance. This is before the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan was launched. We had identified, agri as a large space, and within agri, we had looked at opportunities on the dairy sector. Now, within dairy, we were looking at opportunities to invest in places where there is less penetration of dairy. So we made 2 investments in the dairy sector in Orissa and Jharkhand. And as you know, both Orissa and Jharkhand are tribal states. So typically tribals don't raise cattle, right? But because we had a large portfolio in microfinance, we were able to create the supply chain for these dairies to procure through those, loans which were funding cattle. And then, these dairies have become pretty large dairies in their particular states, Milk Mantra and Osam.
Yeah.
And so for each particular fund, there is a certain thesis. For each particular investment, we would have a unique thesis of impact for that investment. If it doesn't meet that impact criteria, it has to be inherent in the business model. So it should not be one coming at the cost of it. Yeah. And the impact should not come at the cost of scale. So it, it should not create a trade-off that I have to either do impact or I have to create my financial return. It has to be inbuilt in the business model. And
Right.
as long as that criteria is met, then we look at it like a conventional basis, in terms of looking at what are the risks of investment, scalability,
Right.
unit economics, and how far it can go.
Correct. So, Anurag, now we are really going through these tough times, pandemic, a lot of migrant laborers again going back, job losses happening all across. There is sense of urgency. Now, government is doing its part, but how do you really see the importance and future of impact investing in India? Now, apart from importance, now what I see happening now, there is also sense of urgency. So, how do you see it? How do you see the future of impact investments in India shaping up maybe in a horizon of 2 to 3 years?
So we are actually very, very bullish about the future of impact investing. When we started in 2001, there was nobody doing it, right? There was only us and one US-based fund, and cumulatively put together, we were nothing in terms of a size. In the last 20 years, in 2007-8, this really started gaining some momentum. In the last 20 years, the kind of uh, uh, acknowledgement and momentum this has gained. Today in India, we have a body called the Impact Investor Council, which basically has its members as all the investors who claim to be impact investors, right? So it has about 35 odd investors who are members of that, and it has at least 45-50 affiliate members, who are doing something in the field of impact investment. Along with the direct equity investors that are directly participating. Uh, in the last 3-4 years itself, right? There has been a lot of focus. 2015, the Sustainable Development Goals were announced by the UN. 193 countries signed up for it. We are currently in 2020, and these goals were big, audacious goals. 17 SDGs that were announced and signed by all these countries. Things like zero hunger, no poverty, climate action. There are 17 of them, very, very specific. Each goal has very, very specific targets associated with it, which each country has committed to achieve by 2030. Now with this COVID happening, a lot of that has got pushed back. A lot of progress that has been made over the last 20 years in terms of poverty reduction, in terms of ensuring food, quality of life for people. There has been a lot of pushback that has happened already. We were already seeing a huge amount of capital flow. Our belief is that now the financial investment world cannot just focus on just pure returns. They will have to look at impact with resilience. The capital is obviously looking for security. It is looking for how do you mitigate risk, and until and unless sustainability and resilience is built into the investments, it is going to be extremely difficult for allocators of capital to deploy it without that risk mitigant. So our expectation is that in the coming decade, impact investing, in fact, will become the mainstream of investing. And there were things like ESG and do no harm kind of investing, which was anyways happening. There were big, large private equity investors like Bain Capital, TPG, KKR, all announcing $1 billion plus kind of impact investing funds already. So there was big flow and movement towards impact investing already, but this disruption due to COVID will only increase the consciousness of people and basically make this mainstream. That is our point of view.
Interesting. So one very critical point which has emerged is that the kind of impact which COVID has had, it is really undone a lot of good work which was done over the last 2 decades. And also the fact now that there is a sense of urgency, and you see that impact investing will be the way forward. In fact, it will be one of the biggest mode of investing happening in India. So very critical insights which you have given. Now, in all this happening and all this getting scaled up, what is the role of technology you are seeing? For instance, now a lot of DBT has happened. A lot of DBT has happened probably because of Aadhaar seeding, then your mobile telephone being having that kind of penetration across rural India, the entire stuff which is happening. So, what role you see of this technological changes? How will it really accelerate the entire process of going to maybe even the bottom of the pyramid, reaching out and creating that kind of social impact? And what roles you see that maybe entities like fintechs and all can play in here?
Yeah, so again, we are not tech investors as such, but technology plays a very, very core role to any business that we invest in. So we are not necessarily investing in a company which is, coming up with new technology that is going to create a behavioral change, or it's a company which is coming with artificial intelligence and things like that. But if there is a company which is trying to reach out to very large number of low income people, we think technology is going to be absolutely essential to drive efficiency, to drive unit economics, and to make that business viable. So if technology is not at the heart of such a business, it is just simply not going to take off at all. So either for customer acquisition, or for, let's say, if it's a lending company, credit analysis. In fact, you yourself are CEO of a fintech company, so you are directly very closely involved with the use of technology in reaching out to a large number of people, which would simply not be possible if you were to do it in a physical way. So technology is in some ways inherent in every single business that we are involved with, and we look at it as more as an enabler. But again, this disruption, what it has done is it has pushed people to hasten the deployment and the digital transformation process. And I think that is a very, very positive development. Maybe I can throw that same question back at you as well, and ask you about your experience, because the kind of business that you run, I don't think it's going to be possible before without the adoption of technology.
Yeah, so very valid point, Anurag. So if I talk in these times of pandemic itself, had we not had the entire e-stack, we would not have been able to really do the lending work. So today what happens is, it's entirely if you wish to, and depends upon the kind of product and the kind of segment you are reaching to and the kind of lending you intend to do. But the entire logic and the entire rules behind KYC, for instance. Now you have the option of doing entire eKYC. So you can do the KYC, the know your customer part, totally in a paperless way. Similarly, the credit engine is anyway there. You get a lot of algorithm. You have bank statement readers. I mean, you just get scanned images, and you can do multiple operations on that. You create a lot of data points. So that all anyway goes on in arriving at a score and credit worthiness of the guy, and also from whatever you get from various bureaus and other footprints. Apart from that, when we talk about agreements, earlier agreements used to be physically signed, the loan agreements. Now you get it e-signed, right? So it's very simple process again. Aadhaar-based e-sign happens, and that entire e-stack is anyway there. When we talk about entire disbursement, so giving money is simple, but then you have to collect it also, right? So that entire collection piece, I mean, I remember the earlier days. In fact, since I also trace my back to again ICICI Bank days, so we used to have physical PDCs taken from customers, right? So and if you are giving a loan of say 10 years or 15 years, or say if you are giving a housing loan, typically it will be about 20 years. So you can't really have PDCs of 20 years with you. So PDCs used to get exhausted. And maybe after every 3-4 years, 5 years, you again had to do the same exercises. Then you had auto debit and ECS and all stuff coming. Now we have reached a time where eNACH is set up just like that. So even for people who are at bottom of pyramid, or people who are not all that literate, for instance, we already had Aadhaar-based authentication, which because of some privacy issues was shelved for some time. So it was only left with debit card and net banking authentication. But now again, we have the permission coming. So I think within the next maybe 2 to 3 weeks itself, entire eNACH, which is as of now restricted to debit card and net banking, it will move to Aadhaar again. So anybody who's even at the bottom of the pyramid, they have their Aadhaar, they have their mobile number, OTP-based authentication. So things have become very, very simple. And important is that in these in times of COVID, when there was really, people were really tough, things were really stretched out. So if you look at the normal Kirana person, now a lot of our existing customers, or some of the new customers which we onboarded, we did it through a completely contactless process. And a small Kirana people also, we were able to extend credit line because of the use of technology. So yes, technology plays a very, very crucial role in the work which we are doing, or even the way you all are. So technology is a big leveler, I say. It levels everything. So it's no more, I think, that reaching to the bottom of the pyramid and gaining that scale, becomes much easier for us now with the help of technology. Now, this takes us to the another question when we talk about making things open and equal and all. So there's a lot of discussion in RBI is also. I mean, SEBI has come again with this discussions around social stock exchange. So since you are one of those thought leaders there, and your views are also of great influence in coming up with the entire structure. So Anurag, how do you think the future of social stock exchange? That is one, and how will it broadly function? Because many people here, I'm seeing certain queries also cropping up that how will these social stock exchanges actually function? Will it be too democratic that anybody can go list? Will it be more philanthropy driven, or will it be more money driven, or will it be something in between? So your thoughts on that, Anurag?
So actually, we were part of that task force, which was, the finance minister, as you know, had announced this in the budget speech, and then they had set up a task force of people who would, make these recommendations. So we were actually part of the task force which was deliberating this, and have actually had a lot of inputs to give in that white paper that has come out from SEBI recently. So the way these deliberations went, this was divided into two groups. One was for the for-profit side, and one was for the not-for-profit side. So there was clear demarcation done. Our focus was more on the for-profit part of the recommendations, whereas there was another group which was looking at the not-for-profit segment. So there is a clear distinction within that social stock exchange paper on the FPOs and the NPOs in terms of the set of recommendations for each. Now, the moment you talk about a stock exchange, you're dealing with public money, and it is extremely important that as a SEBI, as a regulator of for investors, their first and foremost requirement is how do you safeguard the investor interest. So anybody who wants to list on a social stock exchange, there will be certain minimum reporting standards, and there will be certain minimum checks that will need to happen on those reportings to make sure that it is a genuine case and not somebody who is just pretending to be impact enterprises and therefore taking capital around it. So first and foremost, there is an issue around definitions. So we've been grappling around, what is an appropriate definition, both at ISE and at the social stock exchange. So there have been things around, what is the intentionality of that institution to create impact. So you're doing a business. How do you differentiate between one entity which is doing some work and creating impact as a corollary to the work that they're doing, versus another company which is set up for impact, and who decides that, right? So one of the ways to sort of look at that is setting up a protocol of measurement, right? So there are going to be some definitions that would come in terms of who's eligible, who's not, and it will come with a certain set of reporting requirements, and post reporting there will be some auditing that would need to happen to ensure that the people who are listed there are genuine. If you do qualify, what they're trying to do is to lower the threshold in terms of what is typically required in a main board's listing versus that the requirements that will be there. So it will come with slightly lower thresholds in terms of requirements, but with clear obligations on reporting on impact and measurement of that through an independent third party. There also is a recommendation on whole set of fiscal measures in terms of tax holidays and some rebates on taxes, etc. Even on the not-for-profit side, for example, if you today were to give a donation to the PM Care Fund, it will be 100% exempt. But if you give a donation to a private not-for-profit institution, it is only 50% exempt, for example. So those kind of recommendations are also there. There's also some forward-looking ideas of even coming up with something called an impact currency, which can be traded. So there are lots of ideas, but I would say it's still at a very, very early stage. A lot more work needs to happen in terms of making sure that it's watertight in terms of who can get in. And I think the key focus from a SEBI point of view is to create accountability and adequate measures, safety measures for the investors.
True. So really loved your explanation coming from the real people who are behind all these ideas. So we will pick up some questions too. A lot of questions coming, and of course we have another 10 minutes at least left, factoring a bit of delay start due to some tech glitches. So now this question I think you have already answered. It's from its abbreviated name I can see on the screen. Mr. PKG. He's an advisor and mentor with Malabar Angel. So he's asking if the social stock exchange is for NGOs or for profit enterprises, which I think you have anyway answered in detail in the discussion. So there's another question which I'd like to take up. This from Dilip. So Dilip is founder of Idea High. So his question is, for a social entrepreneur working on subjects like water, climate change, livelihood, what are the various funds one could look at, India and overseas? Social impact funds, philanthropic funds, grants. This is his question. He wants to really understand. So, and probably he also wants to understand it in a way that probably should he really focus on philanthropy or should he go to some entities like yours and maybe, of course, overseas entities? Kya Anurag, your views?
Yeah, so I think it really will depend on what is your intention to do with the business, who are your target customers or beneficiaries, and what is the engagement model, right? Can you create a business model which is scalable and has strong unit economics? Then you can go to impact funds or investors who are looking to generate a return on that investment. If that is not the case, if you are really looking at serving people in a non-commercial way, then you would have to go to grant makers. Like I said, if you just look up the Impact Investor Council and their membership, there'll be more than 30 plus impact funds that will get listed there who are active within India. There are actually a whole bunch of impact funds. In fact, India is actually really the cradle of all experiments in impact investment space. So anybody who's serious about making impact investments, even at a global level, does look at India. So there are a whole bunch of even global impact funds that are looking at India as a destination for deployment of capital. So there is no dearth of capital there. In fact, if you have a very strong business model, even commercial VCs will not shy away from it. So just for example, Avishkar itself had an investment in a water company called Water Life, and a follow-on investment was from a commercial tech VC fund called Matrix.
Yeah.
So those kind of investments have already happened, and people don't shy away as long as the scale potential and the unit economics is well proven, and you have a good team which gives them confidence that you'll be able to take it to the next level. For the not-for-profits, again, there is a lot of work that is happening on the not-for-profit side as well. And I'm not really dealt with the not-for-profit things too much, so I won't get into too much detail there. But again, if you do a simple Google exercise, there are some very large corporates who are very active on the waterfront. Piramal Foundation, for example, does a lot of work in that area. Mr. Nandan Nelekani and his wife was also very active in that area. So there's a lot of work happening there. So in fact, sometimes it is much easier to raise philanthropic capital than equity capital in these kind of subjects.
So there is another question, of course, a bit related to NGOs only, but possibly people want your expert views on that. So this is from Nivedita Datta. She's program manager with Vani. She has two questions. First says that your take on zero coupon, zero principal bonds and social venture funds applicability in Indian NGOs context. And second question says applicability of SSC on NGOs engaged in advocacy.
Yeah, so this is again, one of the recommendations in the Social Stock Exchange white paper itself, which got released. So I think it's a pretty interesting idea. This zero coupon, zero principal bonds have been, it's an idea that is basically originating from these impact bonds that some people have experimented with. Essentially, the idea is that, there is somebody who is willing to pay if certain impact metrics are met. So the first impact bond really started with an organization called Educate Girls in Rajasthan, where a particular funder said that I will underwrite the principal and the coupon payment if the impact metrics are made. So that's basically the core idea behind that, and it is mostly meant for not-for-profit sector. In fact, this has got extended one level further even to the funds. So we have some of our LPs now who are proactively discussing, typically in a fund, the economics is a fee and a carry. So you earn a fee on the assets that you manage, and you earn a carry based on the returns that you make. So there is a certain hurdle rate, and if you cross that hurdle rate, you get to participate in the upsides of the return. You share that with the investors. But there are, concepts that are coming which create a certain hurdle for the impact metrics. So there are upfront impact metrics that are agreed, and then if you are able to exceed that, then you get become eligible for some additional carry, etc. So those kind of concepts are actually gaining more ground. I think the core issue really is, can you create measurable outcomes? So that is the key, and how do you create checks and controls around that? So that is the hard part, and that is what is stopping it from taking off in a really big way.
Yeah, thanks, Anurag. Very informative. So there, of course, plethora of questions still coming, but due to paucity of time, we'll probably like to close the discussion. Very, very interesting, very insightful. We discussed everything right from your learnings and your ethos and your journey from Varanasi to Mumbai, and now how the real entire space is moving, even the future of the social stock exchanges. So very, very I'll say a learning perspective from everybody. I believe the kind of questions also I'm getting, really attendees would have enjoyed that. Now, we missed Avakash in the beginning because of some technical issues. So since he's around, I leave it to Avakash to formally close this.
Avakash, I think you're on mute.
First of all, thank you, Anurag sir, for once again joining today for the second session of yours. And Amit sir, for wonderfully conducting this great session on impact funding. I think the audience has been great. There have been very good questions all around. And I think whatever enriched sessions we had throughout this day, this session had a specific context to it, the future aspect of impact investing. I think it was really enriching and knowledgeable experience for all of us, the way both of you shared your experiences with us. And just thank you once again from all of us, the Miraculous team and the Impact Funding Summit team. Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thank you, Avakash. Thank you, Amit, once again.
Thanks to all the attendees. Thanks a lot. Thank you.